over Cairo, to the accompaniment of which the advancing battalions forged ahead over the endless waste of desert, feebly illuminated by the pale gleam of the waxing moon.
The Turks had to transport howitzers, floating pontoons, food and water across the Sinai Desert, and didn't lose a single man. In the early hours of the 3rd of February 1915, they reached the Suez Canal. The German colonel who had planned the operation now watched it go horribly wrong.
A sentry noticed our attack and fired. The shots created panic. The English then blasted the banks with machine gun fire.
The Turks found the canal defended by 9 British warships and 30,000 Indian troops dug into defensive positions. The Ottoman troops suffered 1,200 casualties. The survivors retreated across the desert. The attack had failed, but Africa was now a battleground in Germany's global war. She had 3 bases of operations: the Cameroons, Germany East Africa, where Letov was still at large, and German Southwest Africa with its ports and wireless stations. Luckily for Britain, she had a colony right next door. Unluckily, it was the one whose loyalty she could least rely on. The Union of South Africa was racially diverse. Blacks, Boers, and British settlers. Just 15 years before, Britain had fought a long, bloody war against the Boers. Many still had little love for Britain. Their loyalty could not be counted on. As one commander told South Africa's Prime Minister, Louis Botha,
"My men are ready. Whom do we fight? The English or the Germans?"
But South Africa was ideally situated to launch an attack on German Southwest Africa. British Colonial Secretary Lewis Harcourt took the gamble.
If your ministers desire and feel themselves able to seize such part of German Southwest Africa as will give them the command of the wireless stations there, we should feel this was a great and urgent imperial service.
South Africa's government readily agreed because it had mini-imperial ambitions of its own. It wanted to seize German Southwest for itself. On the 14th of September 1914, South African forces crossed the Orange River into German Southwest. But the Germans were one jump ahead, as the South Africans found out when they paused at the watering hole of Sandfontein. The South Africans were beaten, but there was worse to come. Part of South Africa now rose up in armed rebellion. Commanding the forces in the Northern Cape was Manie Maritz. Fearless and uncompromising, Maritz had fought a vicious guerrilla campaign against Britain in the Boer War. His sympathies lay entirely with Germany.
I received a telegram ordering me to take a large commando into German Southwest Africa. I was determined not to fight on behalf of the British Empire, and my officers and troops were in full accord with me.
In October 1914, Manie Maritz crossed the Orange River into German territory at Squeet Drift to enlist German support. 2 days later, Moritz addressed his troops under this tree.
Now, men, we don't want to be ruled by the Jews and the financiers of England. General Beyers, General de Wet and myself have decided to form an independent South African Republic and have entered into an agreement with the governor of German Southwest Africa. They will provide us with arms and ammunition, guns. On this step depends the freedom of the masses of the country.
Britain's request for help had brought her dominion to the brink of civil war. In London, the Colonial Secretary Lewis Harcourt feared the breakup of the Union of South Africa. He secretly ordered 30,000 Australian soldiers diverted to the Cape to smother the rebellion.
Safety of the Union is first and paramount consideration. We attach no importance to German Southwest Africa in comparison.
The Australians weren't needed. In the winter of 1914, the loyal South Africans defeated the Boer rebels. This is rare film of 50 of them being led to trial in Cape Town. But they never caught Manie Maritz. By July 1915, South Africa cornered the Germans, forced their surrender, and annexed their colony. And Britain had more work for South Africa, north this time, to deal once and for all with von Lettow. London turned to South Africa's defence minister to lead the campaign, Jannie Smuts. Smuts too had fought in the Boer War, but was now passionately pro-British. More a statesman than a soldier, Smuts made an indifferent general of conventional forces. And he was up against Lettow. British officer Richard Meinertzhagen was now Smuts's intelligence officer.
Smuts is quite determined to avoid a stand-up fight. He told me he could not afford to go back to South Africa with the nickname Butcher Smuts. If von Lettow is clever and Smuts not clever enough, there's going to be trouble.
Lettow was clever. Here, at his headquarters at Moshi railway station, he thought through the idea of depriving Britain of manpower in Europe by opening up the war in Africa.
The question was, could we, with our small forces, prevent considerable numbers of the enemy from intervening in Europe, or inflict substantial damage on their armaments and troops? I strongly believed that we could.
By August 1916, Lettow had become expert at his cat-and-mouse game.
Von Lettow is slippery and is not going to be caught by manoeuvre. He knows the country better than we do. I think we're in for an expensive hide-and-seek, and von Lettow will still be cuckooing somewhere in tropical Africa when the ceasefire goes. Smuts has cost Britain many hundreds of lives and many millions of pounds.
Lettow ran his force of up to 15,000 soldiers, mostly black, on scrounging and improvisation. No supplies from Germany reached him after March 1916, but he made a little go a long way, as Ludwig Deppe, one of his medical officers, noted.
When there was no ammunition, Lettow would try to produce his own cartridges. If the men asked the commander for weapons or clothes, they were told, "Take it from the enemy." Lettow made war at cost price. You'd have been justified in displaying this war at a country fair with a for sale sign. Cheapest war in the world.
Jannie Smuts had 5 times Lettow's force and resources to match. But the further he went into German East Africa, the more stretched his supply lines. And he reckoned without the killer tsetse fly. The life expectancy for his 50,000 horses was just 4 weeks. torrential rain, mud, dust and boiling heat further slowed his progress. Intelligence was sketchy, maps inadequate. Telephone cable often had to be raised to 8 meters to avoid damage by giraffes.
This is like warfare of bygone days. We come along where no road had ever been, where probably white man had never trod before. The river is in flood and we can't get across. On the other side, the German patrols are watching us, but the crocodile hold the peace between us very successfully.
Letov played with Smuts, refusing to fight, slipping away, luring him deeper into Africa. As they went, they spread the war's grief and destruction, dragging in more and more of the people of Africa. This war was being carried on the backs of black Africans. For the Letov campaign alone, the British recruited over 1 million black porters. 1 in 5 died from malnutrition and disease, death rates comparable with those on the Western Front.
They endured their ordeal quietly. They only had duties and hardly any rights. They tumbled into the splashing mud with their heavy loads and were then ruthlessly forced to move on and catch up.
Oh, the Lindy Road was dusty and the Lindy Road was long. But the chap what did the hardest graft, who could not do but wrong, was the Cavarondo porter with his Cavarondo song. It was, "Come here, porter." It was, "Amera, here, get." And Amera didn't grumble. He simply did his bit.
What Smuts saves on the battlefield, he loses in hospital. For it is Africa and the climate we're really fighting, not the Germans.
Out of 20,000 South Africans, over half were invalided home by the beginning of 1917. They were replaced by black troops from Nigeria and Ghana. Recruitment of blacks soared in East Africa as well. Over the course of the war, the King's African Rifles rose from 3,000 men to 35,000. Fuloliani Longwe spoke for many black soldiers.
Think of yourself buried in a hole with only your head and hands outside, holding a gun, death smelling all over the place. Listen to the sound of exploding bombs and machine guns, smoke all over, and the vegetation burnt, and of course deforested. Watch your relatives getting killed, crying, finally dead. These things we did, experienced, and saw.
Letov survived undefeated to the very end, marching triumphantly through Berlin in 1919. The British never caught him, even though they turned it into an African war and set an army on his tail. But Britain and France had such reserves of manpower in their colonies that from 1914 they shipped them to Europe. Remarkable French colour photographs of the world that came to serve on the Western Front. French General Charles Mangin had calculated that France could raise up to 300,000 from her empire for Europe. No one believed him. But in fact, they mobilized double that number.